Valentine's night 1988, Butte Town, Cardiff. A young woman, Lynette White, is reported missing. She hasn't been seen for days.
It was unusual not to have seen Lynette for so long.
I mean, certainly her friends grew concerned about her, which is why eventually they went to the police.
Within hours, police discover her mutilated body.
She was virtually ripped to pieces by somebody with a large knife.
A total of 69 stab wounds, so it had been a very frenzied attack.
An investigation with many false leads results in 3 men being wrongfully convicted.
Their DNA had been done, and it eliminated them all of them.
And stabbed to death, and you sit there and tell us you know nothing at all about it, nothing at all about it, how you can ever, I just don't know how you can sit there.
Nobody would believe this was even credible. However, it happened in real life.
But 25 years after the murder, the use of a groundbreaking DNA technique would lead investigators to the killer.
Forensic science is all about patterns, and so we wanted to get as much of an idea as possible about what had happened in this flat in Cardiff at the time.
I'm in the office and the phone call comes through. You got your match.
I don't think anyone ever found him, other than through the process that we did.
This is the story of the senseless and brutal killing of a young woman. A decades-long police investigation that included one of the worst miscarriages of justice in UK history. And how the evolution of a new DNA method became a world first for the Bloodline Detectives. February the 14th, 1988, Leanne Vilday walked into the Butte Town police station in Cardiff to report that her friend Lynette White was missing.
Lynette White was a prostitute who had been functioning as that since at the age of 14. Leanne Vilday was also a prostitute, was a friend of Lynette's, and she was concerned because she had lent her room to Lynette for use as a place to have encounters with men who were paying for sex with her. But she hadn't been seen for a few days, and she began to get concerned about her.
It was unusual not to have seen Lynette for so long. She had been missing for 5 days. Supposedly she was staying in the flat. They were concerned, especially Leanne.
Certainly her friends thought it was strange that she disappeared and increasingly grew concerned about her, which is why eventually they went to the police.
But the police were already familiar with Lynette White.
She was due to appear as a witness in a couple of court cases relating to low-life activity in Cardiff docks area, and she disappeared.
A warrant was issued for Lynette's arrest, and police had been looking for her all weekend. They accompanied Leanne Vilday to the apartment on James Street.
When they got there, they couldn't gain entry into the flat. So they forced entry, and on forcing entry, that's when they found Lynette White.
Well, it was absolute devastation. They found her body on the floor. She had had a throat cut right the way across the throat. And in fact, there were, I think, a total of 69 stab wounds on her body. So it had been a very frenzied attack.
She was virtually ripped to pieces by somebody with a large knife. mostly in the breast area.
Detectives and forensic investigators soon arrived to assess the crime scene.
The room she's working from is an upstairs flat above her bookies. So at the left-hand side of the bookies, there's a door which is locked, and you go up a stair, and then there's an interior door which was also locked in those days. So you need 2 sets of keys to get into the flat. Lynette would have to let somebody in through 2 separate locked doors.
Lynette was in the room that faced out onto the street. There was a divan on the left-hand side, and she was there dead on the floor.
Her watch was found and it had stopped at 1:45 a.m. and that led police to the conclusion that was probably the time when she was attacked and died.
She'd been stabbed repeatedly near the bed with her head between the wall and the bed, and you could see by the arterial sprays all over the wall in that area that that's where the initial crime and the initial attack had happened. However, at some point after that, her body had been dragged over more towards the window, away from the bed.
A detailed sweep of the room was undertaken to gather as much forensic evidence as possible.
When you talk about 1988, their main focus was fingerprints. There was a box of condoms on the windowsill, used condoms on the windowsill. There was an opened packet and an unused condom on the bed. Clothing would have been recovered off the body. It even ended up with what they were called anhydrin put on the walls, etc., to try and gain fingerprints off the wallpaper, etc.
We're talking about 1988, before DNA was really developed to any sophisticated degree, and at the time it wasn't possible to even contemplate getting a match for it. But of course, it was possible for police forensics to pick up quite a number of samples.
By studying the blood patterns at the scene, police were able to determine that there were 2 different blood samples in the room.
There was cast-off blood under the window near the body, which was clearly not arterial spray from her. It was cast-off blood from the offender. It's very common for somebody who stabbed somebody repeatedly to cut themselves on the knife. At some time during the attack, his hand had slipped down on the knife because the knife handle had got slippery with blood, and he'd cut his own hand.
Every item in the room was taken for analysis.
Everything that was there was sort of taken away and kept with the foresight of what might come in the future, I suppose.
Detectives now needed to learn more about Lynette White. The 20-year-old was a familiar face around Butte Town, but she had a very difficult existence.
This is somebody who was a very vulnerable individual who came from a very disadvantaged background. She dropped out of school when she was very young, and from the age of 14 she drifted into prostitution. She was controlled by a gang who took her over to Bristol, and then she managed to escape from them, came back, but was still involved in prostitution, and obviously was a vulnerable young person who was exploited by those people who wanted to make money out of her.
She was a prostitute, but there's a lot more to her than that. That's how she was categorized. That was what she did to get money, but also she was popular. She was well liked. The community were hard hit when she died.
Lynette was also exploited by her boyfriend, a man called Stephen Miller.
He had a cocaine habit, and he used to get Lynette to pass her earnings on to him so he could buy the cocaine that he needed. And essentially, he was the man who controlled things. She had to do his bidding, but they had this routine. And he survived as a pimp, and she was the prostitute who was used in order to supply him with the money he needed to fuel his cocaine addiction.
The autopsy provided more information for the detectives.
It was immediately obvious to all of us who looked at that crime that this was a sexually motivated homicide. One of the reasons for that is that she's wearing a thick puffer jacket, so her body can't actually be seen. You can see the wounds on her face. There are a few wounds on her face. But when she's at post-mortem, there are 39 or 40 wounds just in the breast area here. So her breasts have been targeted by the offender. The original hypothesis was, by the laboratory and by the police, that this was a lone male, a client. There were good reasons for that. There was some money in her shoe, which is the normal place she would put money from a client. There was an unused condom on the bed. Again, that would be the sort of thing you'd expect of a client. And the whole motivation, the sexually motivated aspect of it, her being stabbed like that, looks like a typical argument with a client who's lost it and has then stabbed it and left.
The investigators were faced with real difficulty. Lynette had clearly brought the person to the flat. But was the killer close to her or an anonymous client? The case was still wide open. In February 1988, the discovery of the mutilated body of well-known sex worker 20-year-old Lynette White began a widespread investigation in the community of Butetown, a suburb of the Welsh capital, Cardiff.
Butetown was the name for the docks area of Cardiff, and so you had this sense of many ships coming in, many deliveries through the port, and lots of people working in the port area, in the dock area. But of course it did mean as well that because of the presence of the sailors coming in and out, that there was a thriving prostitution scene as well. And for many years it had been a place which was regarded by, shall we say, middle-class Cardiff as undesirable.
Lynette was heavily involved in the prostitution and drug scene in Butetown.
She was described by somebody as someone who was the first out after lunchtime and the last working at night. Very tragic young woman who deserved so much more.
As a result of Lynette's lifestyle, detectives immediately knew the suspect pool was wide. And they also suspected that statements gathered from those who knew and worked with her would not be completely reliable.
There were a number of issues going on, as there would be in people's lives who sort of live that type of lifestyle. And there was always gaps in movements, etc., clothing, places that she would frequent.
Investigators were looking for a lone offender, and an obvious suspect was Lynette's boyfriend, Stephen Miller. He was taken in for questioning on the morning after her murder.
He was the boyfriend, and as far as the police were concerned, he was the pimp as well. So he was always going to be a natural suspect for this.
But in meeting with their prime suspect that morning, one thing became immediately apparent to the investigators.
He was wearing the same clothes that he was wearing on the night of the murder. He wasn't bloodstained.
Miller also gave them an alibi, placing him away from the scene of the crime.
He was able to show that he was in a very well-known nightclub at the time of the murder called the Casablanca, where he was playing pool and people had identified him there.
A forensic analysis was then carried out on Miller's belongings and compared to the samples of the foreign blood group found at the scene.
Lynette's sock, one of her socks, which had a blood stain on it, they tested the blood. They discovered that it was not her blood group. It was a rare blood group, AB. So clearly that would lead one to the conclusion that maybe the killer would have had that particular blood group.
It should have been a forensic scientist's dream in terms of investigation, because once you actually find a person, you can compare that person's fingerprints, saliva, blood, etc., footprints, to those found in the flats.
They took his clothes, they took his car, took forensic tests. They were actually unable to find any link at all.
Stephen Miller's alibi, coupled with forensic analysis from the scene, made it impossible for him to be responsible for Lynette's murder.
Forensic science is clearly saying this did not happen.
With one line of inquiry exhausted, detectives then questioned Leanne Vilday, in whose apartment Lynette's body had been found. Leanne claimed she hadn't seen Lynette for 5 days.
The police at that time realistically believed that Leanne Vilday was not quite telling the truth, in so much as to say that she knew more about Lynette's movements than what was being said.
With no major developments from Lynette's circle of friends and acquaintances, police conducted door-to-doors and took over 3,500 statements. From the statements, police were able to begin to look for another potential suspect. He was a man who was seen in the James Street area in blood-stained clothes. A photo fit was released on the Crime Watch TV show, and a man bearing a striking resemblance to the individual was detained on February the 25th. But once again, a strong alibi and forensics cleared him as a suspect. Now the detectives began canvassing known clients of prostitutes and people involved in previous criminal activity from the area.
There weren't so much suspects, there were more persons of interest. There were some that they were taking more seriously than others, and they were looking at very sort of intensely.
One of the people they homed in on was somebody who lived not too far away, who was in fact a paedophile, was someone who had mental illness, and who was regarded as a potentially dangerous figure.
This suspect became known as Mr. X, and when the results of a blood test came back, detectives became even more suspicious of him.
Mr. X has 5 of the relevant blood groups. 1, the result is different, but it's quite significantly different, so you should eliminate him on that alone. But if you look at his character, you can see why they viewed him very seriously.
When interviewed by the police, he admitted that he had in the past paid Lynette for sex, and he was unable to account for his movements or provide an alibi for the period around the murder. For 7 months of the investigation, all of the focus was on Mr. X. But when more detailed DNA results came back from the lab in November, it left detectives at another dead end.
He is eliminated on the basis of DNA and fingerprinting. It wasn't him. However, it's very, very clear the police believed they had got their man.
9 months after the murder of Lynette White, frustrated detectives were back to square one. This was when the case began to take a dark turn. Leanne Vilday and her roommate, Angela Pasela, were brought back in for questioning.
They still believe 9 months later that these individuals knew more about the case than what they were saying.
Basically threatened with prosecution for perjury and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice if she doesn't say what the police want her to say.
Under pressure, the girl's account of the night in question dramatically changed.
Pasela and Vilday said they were in their flat when they heard screaming coming from James Street. So they left there and went to the scene, and when they got to the scene, that's when they saw the murder taking place.
They claimed that 5 men who were already known to police were responsible for the murder. But there was one problem.
The people who were suspected of being in the room, according to the police story, all those people, their DNA had been done and compared to the blood in the room, and it eliminated them all of them.
But then an unrelated event would change the lives of all of these people.
In December 1988, Angela Saylor was badly assaulted by a client, and her blood group was sent into the lab. That turned out to have exactly the same blood groups as the unknown blood from Lynette White's flat.
Clearly, the fact that she had the same rare blood group as the person that they'd come to conclusion was the killer gave them leverage over her, so they frightened her into believing that she was potentially going to face a murder charge. And then, realizing what they wanted to hear, she then named these individuals as being present at the scene and participating in the murder. So armed with that evidence, with inverted commas around it, they then pulled in these guys, and one of them, Stephen Miller, who was the boyfriend and pimp of Lynette, was interviewed for a very long time.
He was interviewed for 12 hours and 42 minutes, almost 13 hours, over the 5-day period. And the questioning was relentless. The pressure was gradually building up. He was denying having had anything to do with the killing. He was denying knowing anything about it. The police officers did not believe him. They kept on and on and on, telling him that he was a liar, telling him how low he was in terms of morality and how he had been using Lynette White.
Oh, you could sit there and say that, being in that room, seeing that girl there in the state she was in, and you were supposed to have had all this wonderful care for her, seeing her damn head hang off, and her arms cut, and stabbed to death, and you sit there and tell us you know nothing at all about it, nothing at all about it, how you can ever, I just don't know how you can sit there.
Then the interviews continue, and then in interviews 18 and 19, he makes incriminating admissions after leading interviews, where in actual fact the police kind of suggest that perhaps he had murdered his girlfriend, and because he was high on drugs he couldn't remember it. And he is beginning to accept that particular scenario.
Into the flat, there she is. I'll give her slaps a few times. Whoop, a knife. Good idea to cut it. And then it goes wrong. It goes very, very wrong.
He began to think maybe he had been there. And that was the beginning of his breakdown, because now he had placed himself possibly in the flat at the time that Lynette was murdered.
And also, I suppose, he was being fed with the information that the witnesses said he was there. So therefore, amazingly enough, you get someone admitting to being present during that murder when that he wasn't. But he's not the only one who said they were there, is he? You know, you're all these witnesses saying it as well.
The group of men who would eventually become known as the Cardiff Five were charged with the murder of Lynette White.
There is no evidence whatsoever that 5 men were in that flat committing this murder, with or without the 2 women Angela Pasila and Leanne Vilde as well. They basically say, it's inconvenient. We're not going to listen to what the crime scene and the evidence is telling us. We know who did it. No, you didn't. You knew what you thought, and you inflicted that and caused one of the worst miscarriages of justice in British history. Nobody would believe this was even credible. However, it happened in real life.
On October the 5th, 1989, what would become the longest murder trial in British history began.
There were 5 men on trial. 2 of them, the Actie cousins, were acquitted. The 3 men who were convicted at this trial in November 1990 were Stephen Miller, Yusuf Abdullahi, and Tony Paris. And so they were all convicted of the murder and given life sentences. But they had always maintained their innocence, and very quickly there was a big campaign that was launched to try to get their convictions overturned. And eventually there was a momentum which grew, and there was an appeal, and the appeal turned out to be successful.
In December 1992, all 3 men had their convictions declared unsafe and unsatisfactory and were released.
But underlying everything was the fact that there was still a killer out there, and clearly someone who was potentially dangerous and needed to be tracked down.
Police were once again back to square one. But science would dramatically change events surrounding the death of Lynette White. By the end of the 1990s, police were still hunting the murderer of 20-year-old Welsh prostitute Lynette White. Lynette had been savagely stabbed to death in the Butetown area of Cardiff in February 1988. And her case had become controversial as a result of the false conviction of 3 men for the crime. With the men now released, the police were back to square one. In 1999, 11 years after the murder, the case was reopened.
We had to set a team up, and whatever we did as far as this investigation was concerned, there had to be no involvement with the previous investigation then.
We knew how much it meant for South Wales Police. South Wales Police needed to get that reputation back of being a force that is capable of investigating the most difficult offences. It had to be very clinical.
Everybody had to be new on this so that they weren't tainted anywhere along the line.
We did everything open, everything above the board. Nothing. We could not put the force at risk of making another mistake. We couldn't do that.
Police went back to the very beginning and began analysing every aspect of the case. But it was the advances in DNA technology that would now be crucial to the investigation. A new forensic team was set up.
DNA profiling was just coming in at the time of the original investigation, and during the years after that and before we were asked to help, there had been a number of advances in DNA profiling. And this case was so important to the police and the local community that every time there was a new technique developed, they would go back to samples, and they took a sample after sample trying these new techniques, and for one reason or another, all of these tests had been unsuccessful.
However, by 1999, 2000, it was much easier to get DNA.
The focus now was to take a fresh look at the old crime scene evidence for any new DNA samples that could be linked to the suspect.
It was very important that we got enough of it and in enough different places to form the kind of picture you would expect if this had come from the offender.
The forensic team went back over every detail of the findings at the crime scene in 1988.
The room itself was quite dark. The only light in it, because there was no electricity in the flat, was from a street light 50 yards away. Now we've got the person who's committed this crime having to find their way out of the flat, a flat that's strange to him. And he's having to do that by feeling his way out, where the door is, where the handle of the door is. And he's got to do that with at least one heavily blood-stained hand, because we know he's cut himself during the crime and is bleeding. We revisited the flat during the night at the same time, so it was equally dark. It was in December, it was dark. And we switched off all the lights so that I could pretend to be the offender in the dark, blundering out of the flat.
And in this case, we were helped partly by the scene photographs that had been taken by the police at the time, which showed long shots and close-ups of a lot of the blood staining, but also because the police, through their interest in fingerprints, areas of the scene, which was incredibly helpful. So it brought the whole scene back to life.
So now work is going on to retrieve a DNA profile from all the places that we've got what we think is foreign blood. All the places we have decided from the crime scene analysis there should be cast-off blood.
Every item that had been preserved from the scene was also closely examined in the hope of finding the offender's DNA.
And one of these items was a small bit of cellophane, which had originally formed the end of one of those cellophane covers that you get on cigarette packets. And so it was just a very small bit of cellophane that had been sort of probably stood on and was completely out of shape. But there was one particular stain on this piece of cellophane which really spiked our interest, and that was because it was a round stain, perfectly round, so it had obviously arisen on this cellophane as some kind of interception of an airborne droplet of blood, and that's exactly what you'd expect to come off an offender, you know, as he was bleeding from the hand or from wherever. And so we were very interested in this small round stain, and we did some profiling on that, and we got a nearly full profile, male profile, of foreign blood. We called it Cellophane Man, and so that was the first time when we got something approaching a full profile that was different from the victim at the crime scene, so we were very excited about Cellophane Man.
Now the hunt was on to find a full DNA profile for Cellophane Man.
Obviously, we were trying to find more of it, and we were trying to find it in areas that looked as if they were relevant to the crime. We looked on a cardboard box which had been near Lynette's head, and there were a few splashes of blood on that, and again, by selecting very carefully one or two individual stains to look at, we found some more of Cellophane Man.
One of the key findings in the flat was we strongly suspected that the blood on the wall underneath the window was cast-off blood from the offender. And the best place to look for that was where the blood had run down. There's a picture of the streak of blood going down and resting on top of the skirting board.
The place had been repainted twice in the intervening years, but we thought, well, why don't we have a look at the board and see if underneath this paint there's any of this blood left, because if we're really lucky, the person who painted over the skirting board first after the attack may not have bothered to wipe down the surfaces first. And then we scraped away under a microscope to remove the layers of paint that had been applied in the intervening time, being very careful not to scrape too deeply, in which case we would lose any blood that was there, or not scrape too shallowly, in which case we'd never expose it. So it was quite a tricky thing to do that. But in that way, we managed to find some blood on the skirting board, and we found some blood that had gone down the back of the skirting board. Obviously there was a little gap there. And by profiling that, we then got a full DNA profile which matched Cellophane Man and matched some of this other blood we were getting. And so we were gradually building up a picture of blood around Lynette's body And then we went on to have a look at her clothing, which was really challenging because it was covered in her own blood, of course, because of all her injuries. And we managed to find some offender blood on her jacket and on her sweatshirt.
The same DNA profile was found on the front door, the exit route for the murderer.
In the end, we had this pattern quite extensive pattern of offender blood in and around the area where the attack happened, on Lynette's body and on the exit route out.
Investigators finally had the definitive forensic evidence that could lead them to solve the case. Just as importantly, it was also proof of who wasn't responsible for the crime.
And that profile wasn't from any of the people who'd been charged initially, nor from any of the witnesses who claimed to have bled at the scene. It was the single lone offender who everybody had suspected way back in 1988.
The race was now on to find out just who was behind the DNA profile. The person who had killed Lynette White.
We need to find out who that belongs to.
By the end of the 1990s, police finally believed they were getting closer to discovering the identity of the killer of Lynette White. Lynette, a Cardiff prostitute, had been murdered in the Butetown area of the city in February 1988. Police had a DNA profile of the killer, but there was a hitch.
Now we've got a full profile, and it's been uploaded onto the DNA database but hasn't hit. So the offender has not committed any crime for which he has had his DNA being taken.
This was a problem for the investigators, who were now closer than ever to tracking down the culprit. Investigators needed to come up with a new plan.
It was thought at that time that familial DNA was a possibility, that crime runs in families, and it's possible that a relative of the offender might be on the database.
And so we looked at our unknown profile and we selected that component of it that was the rarest, and I think it occurred about in 1 in 100 people or something like that. And we then searched the database for people who had this particular component, and we tried to narrow the search as much as possible. So it was the Cardiff area, it was men, and I think there was some sort of age range we put on it.
The initial search resulted in 600 possible matches. The team laboriously whittled those matches down until they came across a sample that caught their attention.
We came up with a figure of the overall rarity of the association with offender blood, and one profile stood out head and shoulders above the other as being a more powerful link than any of the others. And so it was that family that we decided to investigate, or investigate first anyway.
The match on the database was that of a 14-year-old boy who had recently committed a petty crime. Detectives went to speak with him.
So when we went there, obviously the boy's profile didn't match, but the mother said, well, look, I'm separated from the father. So we went up to the father.
And it was very interesting because his DNA was very close to the profile we had, but didn't match, so it wasn't him, but we were getting more confident we were within the right family. We then discovered the father had a brother, so the police took a sample from him and we had a look at him, and again, like the father, he was very close to the offender profile, but not a match. And then the police discovered that there was actually another brother who nobody had seen much for the last few years.
And he said, we don't know where he lives. He's left the family, he hasn't bothered to speak to us for years, etc.
Sure now that they were getting closer to their target, investigators gathered information on the estranged brother and managed to track him down.
So officers went down to see him, told him why we were there, that we wanted his DNA, and when they went to see him and told him what we were doing, he said, well, I can tell you that I did have sex with that woman days before the murder. So alarm bells start ringing, don't they?
He was a man called Geoffrey Gaffur, who had worked as a security guard, lived about 20 miles north of Cardiff, and hadn't actually been named before at all, or hadn't been seen as a suspect.
At that point, we took his DNA, we sent it to Forensic Alliance for them to look at, and lo and behold, the next day, I'm in the office and the phone call comes through, you got your match.
The DNA actually nailed him.
Detectives quickly began looking into Gaffur's history.
Of all the cases I dealt with 40 murders from beginning to end. He's more likely one of the most insignificant individuals I've ever come across.
Very much a loner. He took up a job as a night watchman, so he never had no friends. We tried to do a lot of tracing around his movements, etc. over the years, because if he had committed a murder like this, then has another murder of a similar nature then been committed where he was or where he was working at the time. But nothing ever came of that.
He committed this act and disappeared back, and I don't think anyone ever found him, other than through the framework that we did, the process that we did.
After 15 years of searching for the man responsible for the crime, the arrest of Geoffrey Gaffur had to be carefully planned.
We didn't want to spoil the manner in which the investigation has gone, so the bottom line was we put surveillance on Geoffrey Gaffur, and we were putting in place an arrest and an interview strategy which was going to take place on the Tuesday, and this was a Friday evening. The surveillance team was in place. I got home, lo and behold, I'm having my tea and I get a phone call from the surveillance saying, "Don't want to worry you, however, he's visited 2 shops, he's bought toilet paper, TV Times, and also he's buying packets of paracetamol."
With the purchase of so many painkillers, it quickly became evident what Gaffur was planning.
So I said, either he's got a very bad headache, or he's going to do something stupid, Joe. So I said, get the team in there. They broke in there, they got him, he'd taken all the paracetamols, and it's only then he made a disclosure admitting any sort of involvement.
He says he's taken the paracetamol tablets, he deserves to die because he killed Lynette White, and he knew this was coming, and we rushed him to hospital.
Gaffur spent 4 nights in hospital and was interrogated on his release. He then formally admitted to the murder of Lynette White.
I went there, we argued after I'd given the money because I didn't want to carry on with what I was doing. I wanted my money back, she refused, and I killed her. I just went berserk.
He was quite clear that he was the one that the police were looking for, and was now prepared at last to take his punishment.
Gaffur went to trial for the murder of Lynette White in July 2003.
We were able to prove that case. We proved it on paper. Angela's evidence was very compelling. She took out any question of that was anybody else's DNA. It could only have been one person, the murderer, and that murderer was Geoffrey Gaffur.
I think those cases, and this is a very good example of it, where you're able to provide what turns out to be persuasive evidence to a court to enable it to convict someone, and you automatically and simultaneously exonerate people who had been originally convicted of the crime or charged with the crime or even suspected. It always makes it doubly satisfying, and I think we definitely felt that in this particular case, and felt very sad for the Cardiff 3 for all that they had gone through, as I think, anybody would.
Geoffrey Gaffur was sentenced to life imprisonment.
It's got to be the most rewarding case. You know, it was 4 years in the making for me. And when you think of all the other aspects of what goes on and surrounds all this, you know, it's incredible, you know, what we did achieve.
Familial DNA is an amazing tool because it enables crimes that once were thought to be insoluble, capable of being resolved. People who have been responsible for murders in the past which have not been resolved and where they appear to have got away with it must constantly live in fear of the knock at the door, as happened, of course, to Geoffrey Gaffur, the killer, or the real killer of Lynette White.